Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really deep look into a period that fundamentally reshaped America and, well, the whole world.
Oh, where? We're talking about Harry Truman's presidency and those critical years right after World War II.
Exactly. And we've got a lot of source material here, a really comprehensive look at this pivotal era. Our goal, as always, is to pull out the key insights for you. The driving forces, the main events, so you can get a quick but thorough grasp of why this time was so important.
And it's such a contrast, isn't it? You've got this intense global struggle kicking off,
Right, the Cold War.
while at the same time there are these massive transformations happening within American society itself.
It really is striking. World War II ends, everyone hopes for peace, but almost immediately, this new kind of tension emerges.
Yeah, the Cold War. It becomes the defining international issue for, what, nearly half a century?
Pretty much. Our sources really lay out the roots. Essentially, it's the U.S. trying to contain Soviet communism globally. We usually date it from like 1946 to 91.
That's the standard time frame, yeah. And while the U.S. and USSR never fought directly, this Cold War fueled huge conflicts. Korea, Vietnam.
And tons of smaller fights and proxy wars. It was, at its heart, this big ideological battle. Democracy versus communism.
And the sources give us the U.S. perspective on where it started. They point heavily towards Stalin wanting to carve out these spheres of influence in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, the key thing there seems to be the broken promises from Yalta. The U.S. and Britain thought they'd agreed on free elections.
Right, in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. But Moscow made sure communist governments took hold. And then Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they fell under Soviet domination too.
And Germany itself, I mean, what a symbol. The Western zones eventually become West Germany, democratic. But the Soviets, they hold on to East Germany, no letting go.
The U.S. vision was, spreading democracy, supporting international organizations like the UN, but the Soviets seemed to be backing anti-democratic forces everywhere.
It feels like the realization kind of dawned gradually, but then you get Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. That must have been a shock.
Oh, definitely. March 1946, Fulton, Missouri. Our material flags that as a really stark warning. Churchill basically says, look, Soviet expansion is real, and this isn't going away quickly. It's a long fight.
But, okay, the sources also present the Soviet view of how things went wrong. What were their main complaints?
Well, they felt seriously let down by the Allies during the war. A big one was the timing of the Western Front.
D-Day, you mean?
Yeah. They felt the U.S. and Britain waited too long, leaving the Red Army to face the bulk of the Nazi war machine alone until mid-1944. The cost for them was just astronomical, millions dead.
That's understandable resentment. And wasn't there something about the atomic bomb, too?
Absolutely. They were completely shut out of the Manhattan Project. That bred a lot of suspicion.
And economic.
More friction. The U.S. cut off Lend-Lease aid abruptly in 45. Then, when Stalin asked for a $6 billion loan, the U.S. said no.
But then gave Britain a huge loan shortly after, like $3.75 billion.
Yeah, exactly. So from Moscow's perspective, it looked deliberately punitive.
Because their view is more defensive.
Largely, yes. They'd been invaded through Poland twice in the 20th century by Germany. Massive devastation. So having Eastern Europe as a buffer zone, as they saw it, was primarily about security. Not necessarily step one in some grand plan for world domination, but about protecting their borders.
Okay, so two very different narratives about the origins. But whatever the cause, the result was these clear lines drawn on the map.
Definitely. Korea, Vietnam split into communist north and pro-democracy south. That just set the stage for terrible wars down the line.
And Germany split four ways. And Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, also split. That Berlin situation almost blew up right away, didn't it? 1948.
Yeah, 48, 49, a major crisis. We'll get into that. But even as this division was happening, there were efforts to build, a new order. International organizations were key.
Like Bretton Woods in 1944.
Exactly. That's where the Western Allies set up the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank.
And these weren't just about money, right? The idea was bigger.
Right. It was about promoting global economic growth, stabilizing currencies, helping rebuild, basically embedding countries in a Western-led economic system. And tellingly, the Soviets stayed out.
They declined to join.
Yep. Saw it as a tool of Western influence.
And then, of course, the United Nations. That came out of talks during the war.
Yeah, Yalta, Dumbarton Oaks.
Okay.
The charter was signed in San Francisco in 45.
The structure is, well, familiar now. General Assembly for everyone to talk.
But the real powers in the Security Council, U.S., USSR, China, Britain, France as permanent members, plus others elected.
And the veto. That's the crucial part. Any one of those five can just stop a resolution cold.
Which happened a lot. Its
Right.
main job, on paper, was settling disputes peacefully.
So beyond these big global structures, there was the massive job of just rebuilding, especially Germany. Potsdam dealt with that.
Yeah, punishing war crimes, denazification, that led straight to the Nuremberg trials.
45 to 46, trying top Nazis.
Right. 22 officials, 12 hanged, 7 jailed. Though the sources do mention some legal debate back in the U.S. about whether it was, entirely fair legally. Judicial lynchings, some called it.
Because the crimes weren't clearly defined beforehand?
Something like that, but the trials went ahead. And Germany's partition solidified. The Soviets kept East Germany, stripped resources, didn't want it strong.
While the West saw Germany's economy as vital for Europe's recovery.
Precisely. So you end up with West Germany, independent and democratic by 1949, and East Germany firmly under Soviet control.
Japan was different, though, wasn't it?
Very different approach. General MacArthur basically ran the show for the U.S. They implemented democracy, kind of pushed the Soviets aside, despite their protests.
Were there trials there, too?
Yes, Japanese war criminals were tried between 46 and 48, 7 executed, including Prime Minister Tojo, others imprisoned.
And they got a new constitution.
In 1946, it renounced militarism, set up a Western-style democracy, and the fascinating thing, looking back,
Is how successful Japan became.
yeah, an economic powerhouse within decades, a really striking outcome.
Okay, so the world is being reshaped, rebuilt.
Yeah.
But the Soviet challenge needs a strategy. And that strategy becomes containment.
And George Kennan is the key name here, U.S. ambassador to Russia. In 1947, he sends this famous analysis back to Truman.
The long telegram or the X article.
Both, basically articulating the same idea. He argued the Soviets saw the world as hostile, felt it was their duty to undermine non-communist states, and aimed to expand their influence.
And their actions in Eastern Europe seemed to prove his point.
To Washington, yes. In Eastern Europe, Germany, the Middle East, Kennan's thinking really forms the basis of containment.
Which leads directly to the Truman Doctrine.
Right, that became U.S. foreign policy for like 20 years. The
Yeah.
core promise: the U.S. will support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation.
By armed minorities or by outside pressures, basically will help countries resist communist takeovers.
It was the formal launch of containment, and the first test was immediate: Greece and Turkey.
Britain couldn't support them anymore.
Nope. Two broke after the war. So Truman goes to Congress, March 47, asks for $400 million in aid.
And it worked.
The sources say yes, it helped prevent communist takeovers in both countries. Truman also moved quickly to recognize Israel in 48, seeing it as, a democratic foothold in the Middle East.
So containment wasn't just military. The Marshall Plan shows the economic side, right?
Absolutely critical. Europe was a mess economically after the war. Real fear that poverty would drive people towards communism, especially in, say, France and Italy.
So Secretary of State Marshall comes up with this plan.
Invites European nations to figure out a joint recovery plan, and the U.S. would foot the bill. Huge amounts of money.
And the Soviet reaction?
They walked out of the planning meeting, called it a U.S. plot to dominate Europe, and they forbade Eastern European countries from taking any aid.
Even Czechoslovakia, which wanted it.
Yep, Moscow pressured them to say no. Congress was a bit hesitant at first about the cost.
But then the coup in Czechoslovakia happened. February 48.
Exactly. That Soviet-backed coup really sealed the deal. Congress approved the Marshall Plan. $12.5 billion over 4 years, 16 countries.
And the results were good.
Pretty spectacular, actually. An economic miracle in many recipient countries. Output exceeded pre-war levels, and crucially for the U.S., communist influence in Italy and France weakened.
So containment was working on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
And the U.S. government itself reorganized to manage it.
Big time. The National Security Act of 1947 was huge.
That created the Department of Defense, right? Put the Army and Navy under one roof in the Pentagon.
Yep, under a Secretary of Defense. And it also created the National Security Council, the NSC, to advise the president.
And the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency,
Mhm.
formed around 48, 49.
Right, for intelligence gathering, covert ops. Then, after China fell and Korea started, came NSC number 68 in 1950.
And that called for, what? A massive military buildup.
Basically, yeah, a rigorous worldwide defense against communism. Said we needed an immediate and large-scale buildup of our military.
Which led to actual policies.
Oh, yeah. The first peacetime draft in 48. Congress funded the Vice of America to broadcast Behind the Iron Curtain. The Atomic Energy Commission was set up in 46.
Civilian control over nuclear stuff, but the president gets the final say on using the bomb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the U.S. is building the tools and strategy for this long struggle.
And those tools were needed pretty quickly. Tensions kept rising. The Berlin airlift is maybe the first really big flashpoint.
Definitely. 48 to 49. After West Germany was created, the Soviets cut off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin.
Which was deep inside their zone, an island.
Right. They even cut the electricity. 2 million West Berliners were effectively hostages. It became this huge symbol for both sides.
And the U.S. response was the airlift.
Incredible undertaking. For almost a year, U.S., British, and French planes flew nonstop. 277,000 flights, delivered over 2 million tons of supplies. Food, coal, everything.
This has been incredibly tense. Fear of triggering a war.
Palpable fear of World War III. But it worked. The Soviets eventually backed down and lifted the blockade in May 1949.
So Truman's second term, under Dean Acheson as Secretary of State, sees this containment architecture really solidify.
Yeah, especially with NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed April 4th, 1949.
That was the big military alliance, U.S., Canada, Western Europe.
12 nations initially. Greece and Turkey joined later, West Germany too. The core idea was collective security. An attack on one is an attack on all, a direct warning to Moscow.
And the Soviet response was the Warsaw Pact.
A bit later, in 1955, their own military alliance with the Eastern Bloc countries. The U.S. also built other alliances, like ANZ-US in the Pacific.
Then, September 49, huge news. The Soviets test an atomic bomb.
Game changer. The U.S. nuclear monopoly was over. Now you had two nuclear superpowers. The world felt fundamentally more dangerous.
And just months after that, another blow. China falls to the communists.
Yeah, late 1949. Mao Zedong's forces defeat Jiang Jishi's nationalists despite U.S. support for Jiang. Jiang flees to Taiwan.
That must have felt like a massive defeat for containment in D.C.
Huge. A quarter of the world's population now under communist rule. Truman got a lot of blame, though he famously said China wasn't his to lose.
And the U.S. refused to recognize Mao's government. Red China.
For decades, they insisted Jiang's government on Taiwan was the legitimate one, kept its seat on the UN Security Council. The Soviets boycotted the council in protest over that for a while. PRC didn't get the seat until '73.
And the arms race just kept escalating. Hydrogen bomb next.
U.S. tests the H-bomb in '52. Much, much more powerful. Some scientists were deeply troubled, called it genocidal.
Soviets weren't far behind.
Tested their own H-bomb in '53. So now you have this terrifying thermonuclear arms race underway.
The realization must have sunk in.
Yeah.
Humanity could actually destroy itself now.
A chilling new reality, and all this tension finally explodes into major war in Korea, 1950 to '53.
Korea was split after WWII, right? Soviets in the north, U.S. in the south.
Yep, along the 38th parallel. Rival governments were set up, Kim Il-sung in the communist north, backed by Moscow.
And wasn't there some statement by Acheson that seemed to leave Korea out of the U.S. defense zone?
There was a controversial speech, and U.S. troops in South Korea had been reduced. So, June 25th, 1950, the North Korean army invades. Soviet tanks, they roll over almost the entire South very quickly.
Truman's reaction?
Immediate. He dusted off NSC-68, basically, called for that massive military buildup. Defense spending quadrupled. 3.5 million troops, $50 billion a year.
And the UN got involved.
Yes, the Security Council condemned the invasion. Russia was absent, boycotting over the China seat and called for military aid. A UN force was put together, led by General MacArthur, taking orders from Washington, mostly U.S. troops.
But initially things went badly.
Very badly. By August 50, the North Koreans had pushed the UN forces into this tiny corner around Pusan. Looked like they might lose the whole peninsula.
But then MacArthur pulls off the Incheon landing.
Brilliant move. A surprise amphibious landing way behind enemy lines totally changed the momentum. Within weeks, they retook Seoul, pushed the North Koreans back past the 38th parallel.
So the goal then shifted. Not just defense, but reunification.
With Truman and UN backing, yes, MacArthur pushed north towards the Chinese border. The aim became a unified democratic Korea.
Uh-oh. China border. That sounds risky.
Extremely. And in November 1950, it happened. 300,000 Chinese soldiers pour across the Yalu River, completely surprised the UN forces.
And drove them back.
Big time. A brutal retreat, heavy losses back across the 38th parallel, real fear that Korea was lost.
Which leads to the big Truman-MacArthur clash.
Right. Truman, listening to his advisors, opts for a limited war. Keep the objectives specific, restore the border, don't risk wider war with China, maybe even Russia, don't use nukes.
But MacArthur wanted total victory.
Famously said, there is no substitute for victory.
Yeah.
He wanted to bomb China, maybe use atomic weapons. He felt the politicians were tying his hands.
And he publicly criticized Truman's strategy, went around him.
He did. He even issued his own ultimatum to North Korea, undercutting Truman's negotiation attempts. It was a direct challenge to the president's authority as commander-in-chief.
So Truman fired him, a hugely popular general.
Huge controversy. MacArthur came home to massive parades, a hero's welcome. Congress investigated.
But Truman held firm.
He did. Argued successfully that civilian control of the military was paramount. You couldn't have generals making foreign policy or starting World War III. It was a defining moment for that principle.
So the war drags on. Ceasefire talks start in 51, but stall.
For 2 years, yeah. Bloody fighting continued along the front. Then Eisenhower runs for president in 52, promises to go to Korea.
And he does. And maybe threatens nukes.
He won, visited Korea, and the sources suggest he let it be known the U.S. might escalate, potentially using nuclear weapons if a deal wasn't reached.
But finally, a ceasefire in July 53.
Yep. Armistice signed. Restored the border at the 38th parallel, created the DMZ, still technically in effect today.
But Americans were disappointed. Not like the clear win in WWII.
No, it felt ambiguous, costly. Over 54,000 U.S. dead, 3,000 other UN troops. Huge casualties on all sides, potentially 4 million total dead, mostly civilians.
But it did stop the invasion and showed U.S. commitment to containment.
Yes. It proved the U.S. was willing to fight at great cost to stop communist expansion, even in Asia.
Okay, so that's the global firestorm. But back home, Truman's dealing with huge domestic stuff, too. His first term sounds tough.
Yeah, lots of post-war adjustments. Labor unrest was a big one. Remember, wages were mostly frozen during the war.
So strikes erupted afterwards.
Big time. 1946, over 4 million workers went on strike. Steel, auto, coal, major shutdowns. John L. Lewis and the coal miners were prominent, demanding better pay and safety.
And this led to a conservative backlash. Republicans won Congress in 46.
They did. And their response was the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, passed over Truman's veto.
What did it do, mainly? Weaken unions.
That was the goal. It allowed an 80-day cooling-off period before strikes in key industries. It outlawed the closed shop where you had to be a union member before getting hired.
But it allowed the union shop,
Yeah.
where you had to join after being hired.
It did, though many unions hated it. And despite Taft-Hartley, union membership remained pretty high. But then states started passing right-to-work laws.
Which banned the union shop, too.
Exactly. By 54, 15 states had them. So a definite pushback against labor power.
But Truman also made progress on civil rights.
Yes, some important steps. Partly driven by activists, partly the Cold War context. Hard to preach democracy abroad while practicing segregation at home.
He set up a committee in 46.
President's Committee on Civil Rights, their 1947 report to secure these rights was huge. Called for desegregation, anti-lynching laws, ending poll taxes, bold stuff.
And he acted on some of it.
Used executive orders in 1948, banned racial discrimination in federal hiring, and, crucially, ordered the desegregation of the armed forces. That was largely done by 53.
And this is happening around the same time Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in baseball.
Yeah, 1947. So changes were starting slowly.
There were also a couple of, structural government changes. Succession Act.
Presidential Succession Act of 1947 set the line after the VP, Speaker of the House, Senate President pro tem, Secretary of State, apparently prompted partly by fears of nuclear war decapitating the government.
And the 22nd Amendment. Term limits.
Ratified in 51, limited presidents to 2 terms or 10 years max if they took over from a VP, largely seen as a reaction by conservatives to FDR's 4 terms, feeling Democrats had been in power too long.
Okay, so all this domestic policy is happening, but it's against this backdrop of intense fear. The Red Scare.
Yeah, the second Red Scare, this deep paranoia about communists infiltrating America.
What fueled it? It seems like a perfect storm.
It really was. Fear of actual spies, Alger Hiss, the Rosenbergs, those cases got huge attention. Fear of nuclear war, especially after the Soviets got the bomb in 49, then the H-bomb.
The spread of communism globally must have played a big role. Eastern Europe, China, Korea.
Definitely heightened the anxiety. And you had politicians who were more than willing to exploit those fears. HUAC, McCarthy.
And maybe even lingering economic anxiety. Fear that a recession could make communism look appealing here.
That's part of the mix too, yeah. Plus you saw it reflected in culture. Those sci-fi movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Enemy Within, Unseen.
How did the government respond, besides containment abroad?
Domestically, they used tools like the Smith Act of 1940 made it illegal to advocate overthrowing the government. Truman's administration used it to jail Communist Party leaders in '49.
And HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, was very active.
Very. Created in '45, really ramped up, became notorious for sensational hearings, going after Hollywood figures, liberals, anyone connected to the New Deal.
The Alger Hiss case was huge for HUAC, wasn't it? And for Richard Nixon.
Absolutely. Hiss was this establishment figure, former State Department official. Nixon led the charge against him. Hiss denied being a communist agent but got convicted of perjury in '50. It made Nixon a national figure.
And Truman had his own anti-communist program, too. Loyalty oaths.
Yeah, maybe partly to deflect criticism that he was soft. The Attorney General listed 90 disloyal groups. The FBI got more power to investigate suspected Reds.
Millions of federal employees investigated.
Over 3 million by the Loyalty Review Board. Only about 200 were actually fired, but thousands resigned or were dismissed under pressure. Civil liberties definitely took a hit. People were scared to criticize policy, own certain books.
Loyalty oaths became common.
Increasingly, yeah, especially for teachers.
And Congress passed laws like the McCarran Act.
McCarran Internal Security Bill, 1950. Required communist groups to register, barred members from defense jobs or travel. Truman vetoed it, called it a step towards a police state, especially a provision allowing detention during emergencies, but Congress passed it over his veto.
The Rosenberg case seems like the most extreme example. Execution for espionage.
Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, executed in '54 for allegedly giving atomic secrets to the Soviets. They were communists. Hugely controversial case.
And a Hollywood blacklisting.
A dark chapter. Many in Hollywood had associated with the Communist Party in the '30s. HUAC went after them. The Hollywood 10 refused to testify, went to prison. The industry then blacklisted about 250 people, actors, writers, directors, ruined careers.
But the name everyone remembers from this era is McCarthy.
Senator Joseph McCarthy, Republican from Wisconsin, became the ultimate demagogue of the Red Scare.
How did he get so powerful? He started with claims about communists in the State Department.
February 1950. Claimed he had a list. Never really proved anything substantial, but his technique was effective. Wild accusations, guilt by association, waving documents. The public, scared, often believed him.
And he went after everyone. Democrats, Truman, even George Marshall.
Nobody was safe. Accused Democrats of treason. Hinted Eisenhower was soft. Called Marshall a conspirator. Used smears about homosexuality alongside communism. It was vicious.
His Senate hearings created this atmosphere of fear and conformity.
Absolutely. Televised spectacles. Everyone was walking on eggshells. Even Eisenhower, who despised him, mostly stayed quiet publicly.
What finally brought him down?
He overreached. Took on the U.S. Army in 1954. The televised Army McCarthy hearings exposed his bullying tactics, especially under questioning by Army lawyer Joseph Welch.
Have you no sense of decency, sir?
That famous line. Public opinion turned. The Senate finally condemned him in December '54. He died a few years later.
Did that end the Red Scare?
Not entirely. The worst hysteria faded, but the fear lingered. Sputnik in '57 caused another wave of anxiety about Soviet superiority. Bomb shelters, duck and cover drills. Groups like the John Birch Society kept up the hunt for communists.
Arthur Miller's play The Crucible captured that atmosphere, using the Salem witch trials.
Perfect allegory for McCarthyism. Became an instant classic.
Okay, let's shift back to politics. The 1948 election, Truman's surprise win.
One of the biggest upsets in U.S. history. Everyone thought Dewey would win easily.
The Democrats were split three ways, right?
Truman in the middle, Henry Wallace running on a progressive ticket to his left, and Strom Thurmond leading the segregationist Dixiecrats on the right, splitting the South. Republicans nominated Dewey again.
And Truman ran on what he called the fair deal.
Yep. Housing, jobs, higher minimum wage, farm supports, extending Social Security, civil rights. A continuation and expansion of the New Deal, basically.
And he pulled it off.
How? Built a coalition of farmers, workers, and crucially African Americans who felt threatened by the Republican platform. Won decisively. Democrats took back Congress, too.
This period, from '48 into the '60s, some call the vital center. What does that mean?
It suggests that despite political fights, there was a kind of broad agreement, a consensus on some core ideas shared by both parties.
Like what?
3 main things, according to the sources. 1, anti-communism and containment. Everyone agreed on that.
Okay.
2, a belief that economic growth could solve most problems, A rising tide lifts all boats, as JFK later put it.
On three.
Political pluralism, a general acceptance that different groups and ideas could compete and that the basic framework of the New Deal was here to stay, even if Republicans didn't want to expand it much.
And the presidents during this time fit that mold. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson.
Pretty much, yeah. They all operated within that broad consensus.
But the sources say this consensus had flaws, blind spots.
Big ones. Vietnam would eventually shatter the agreement on containment. Persistent poverty showed the rising tide wasn't reaching everyone. Maybe 25% of Americans were still poor.
And Jim Crow segregation was hardly pluralist.
Exactly. A massive contradiction.
And this vital center falls apart around 1968.
That's the argument. Vietnam divides everyone, hawks versus doves. Generational conflict explodes, and you get this powerful white conservative backlash.
Against the Great Society, civil rights' perceived breakdown of law and order.
Right. And that backlash helps Republicans dominate the presidency for much of the next couple of decades. Archie Bunker and All in the Family kind of captured that cultural moment, didn't he? The lovable bigot reflecting those resentments.
Going back to Truman's Fair Deal specifically, what did he actually get done domestically beyond the 48 platform?
He had some wins, raising the minimum wage, funding public housing, significantly expanding Social Security in 1950. Those were important.
But the big-ticket items failed. National health insurance.
Yeah. Things like that, major new initiatives, mostly got blocked. Even his farm price support plan failed.
So he protected the New Deal, but couldn't really build much on top of it.
That's the assessment. That conservative coalition in Congress, Republicans and Southern Democrats held the line against major expansion.
And by 52, Truman decides not to run again. Korea stalemate, inflation.
Yeah, war fatigue, inflation, some scandals. He stepped aside. The election pitted Democrat Adlai Stevenson against the hugely popular war hero, Dwight Eisenhower.
With Nixon as VP, and Ike won big.
Landslide. 442 electoral votes to 89. A changing of the guard.
Okay, one last big area to cover. Just the massive social and economic shifts happening in America after the war. The GI Bill seems crucial.
Absolutely fundamental. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 passed partly out of fear of mass unemployment when 15 million GIs came home.
But it ended up boosting the economy.
Massively. Sent millions of vets to college or vocational school on the government's dime. Huge investment in human capital. Plus, VA loans for homes, farms, businesses fueled prosperity.
And that prosperity plus confidence leads to the baby boom.
Unprecedented. 63.5 million babies between 46 and 61. Huge demographic bulge. The population soared, especially in suburbs.
And the economy itself was booming, the affluent society.
Roughly 1950 to 1970, national income doubled, then doubled again. Americans had something like 40% of the world's wealth with only 6% of the population.
Homeownership climbed dramatically.
To 60% by the mid-50s. And the workforce was changing too. While the image was the male breadwinner, lots of women were entering the workforce, mostly in office and service jobs.
Creating a tension between the ideal homemaker image and reality.
Definitely. The sources point to that tension as one factor behind the feminist movement later in the 60s, also fueling the boom. Massive defense spending, cheap energy, rising productivity. The average standard of living doubled.
Which means consumerism.
Exploded. Cars, TVs, appliances, vacations. People had money to spend.
The middle class swelled dramatically.
More than doubled between 47 and the early 60s, and they were moving. Where?
To the suburbs, grew way faster than cities.
Driven by cars, highways, government mortgage policies, and, yes, white flight from cities as minority populations grew there.
And this suburban life came with its own ideology, the cult of domesticity.
A strong resurgence. Magazines, TV shows, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, all pushed this image of women finding fulfillment solely as wives and mothers at home.
Dr. Spock's baby book was huge then, right?
Sold millions. The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care reinforced the idea that child rearing at home was a woman's primary job, though it also told parents to trust their instincts.
Okay, final big shift. Sunbelt versus Frostbelt.
Huge demographic movement. The Sunbelt, basically the southern tier of states from Virginia across to California.
What drove the growth there? Air conditioning seems like a big factor.
Made those hot climates livable year-round. The Sunbelt grew twice as fast as the industrial Northeast in the 50s. California becomes the biggest state by 63.
Why were people moving there? Jobs?
Lots of reasons. War industries during and after WWII. High-tech later, especially on the West Coast. Aerospace. Big military bases in places like Texas and Florida. Cheaper living, often non-union labor.
And the impact on the old industrial areas,
Mm.
the Rust Belt.
Decline, lost jobs, lost population, lost political power, growing resentment towards federal money flowing south and west.
And the political power shift followed the people.
Undeniably, every president since '64 has come from a Sun Belt state. Congressional representation shifted dramatically.
Wow. So Truman's years, it's this incredible mix, this intense Cold War struggle defining foreign policy.
And containment shaping everything. Military buildup, the Red Scare at home.
While domestically, you have this unprecedented boom. The GI Bill, baby boom, suburbs, women's roles changing, the Sun Belt rising, all happening at once.
These global and domestic forces just constantly feeding off each other, shaping modern America.
Which leads us to that final thought, that
Yeah.
question the sources implicitly raise for you, the listener, to consider.
Yeah, thinking about this whole period, 1945 to maybe 1960, to what extent was there real conformity in American society? Or was it more of a maybe fragile consensus?
I mean, think about the pressure of the Red Scare. That seems like forced conformity, right? Stifling dissent.
But then you have the economic boom, the suburban dream, yes, but also the seeds of the civil rights movement, early challenges to traditional gender roles. Were those just exceptions, or were they signs of deeper currents running underneath that surface consensus?
How much real unity was there versus just, pressure to fit in during a tense time?
It's a great question to chew on. How did the Cold War anxiety and the post-war prosperity interact to shape the culture and politics of the time? Our sources really just scratch the surface. Lots for you to explore further.